It was a night meant for celebration. 15,000 people rose to their feet not for a song, but for a whisper of a name. Under the glare of Madison Square Garden, she sang, "Happy Birthday, Mr. President." The applause was thunder, and the image would become an icon, and months later, a haunting punctuation to a life that ended in silence. 10 weeks after that breathless moment, she would be found alone in her bedroom. Pills on the nightstand. Questions in the press. Please help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Whispers in the corridors of power. And an America suddenly asking, how did a star touch the highest office and then fall so far, and what else was she carrying into that dark night? She was born Norma Jean Mortensen, a foster child who became a global symbol, Marilyn Monroe. By the early 1960s, she was a commodity and a contradiction worshipped on screen, fragile off it, surrounded by handlers, doctors, and men who promised rescue and power. Her life was played out in public, but there were parts kept behind closed doors. Late-night phone calls, intimate meetings, and an unsteady ledger of pills and doctors. Against this starry backdrop stood a presidency that glittered in public and seethed with urgent private calculations. John F. Kennedy, magnetizing, dangerous, always surrounded by aides and secrets, occupied a particular place in American imagination. His brother, Robert F. Kennedy, operated with equal intensity in the shadows. A prosecutor by trade, a man of politics and will. Both Kennedys would later be linked to Marilyn in rumor, memory, and in documents that whisper of surveillance and concern. Law enforcement watched too. The FBI and other agencies kept folders on the intersections of Hollywood and Washington not only for prying curiosity, but because celebrity and power can carry political risk. Those files would later be released, showing a scatter of names, gossip, and the institutional sense that something in Marilyn Circle was more than just showbiz drama. Holiday seasons in Washington and Hollywood were more than parties. They were salons of influence, Christmas dinners, and gala fundraisers where stars and statesmen orbited one another. It's in that seasonal bustle under glitter, under mistletoe and candled tables that relationships were kept, favors traded, and, some would argue, vulnerabilities exposed. This is where our story begins. Not with a full answer, but with an intersection. Fame walking into power's rooms and the consequences that followed. On the evening of August 4, 1962, the house at 12305 Fifth Helena Drive in Brentwood was dark except for one room. Marilyn had been troubled for weeks, erratic on set, dismissed from a film, increasingly dependent on sleeping medication, and in the care of doctors who checked in and out like stage managers. At about 8:30 to 10:30 p.m., the rigor mortis placed in later reports indicates she likely stopped moving. By dawn, her body was discovered. The official cause of death, acute barbiturate poisoning, would be recorded, and the city would try to stitch reason into the unraveling. What investigators found that morning were the clinical details that suggested overdose. Empty pill bottles for barbiturates beside the bed, a body with no external wounds, and a stomach that the coroner and later toxicologists would say contained no obvious recent food, but did show evidence of the drug's potency in her blood and liver. The coroner, Dr. Theodore Curfey, labeled the death a probable suicide, aided by psychiatric interviews that painted a portrait of a woman in psychiatric disturbance. But a death that looks like suicide in a medical report can carry other sounds in the press and the public ear. When a woman adored by millions dies with links to the most powerful family in the country, stories proliferate, rumor, accusation, and the kinds of conspiracy narratives that thrive on missing pieces. Within months, theories would circulate that her death was not simply the tragic collapse of a complicated life, but part of a shadow play involving national figures. Some of those claims would name the president and his brother. Others would trace mob ties and illicit surveillance. The official record would be plain. The world would not be satisfied. Investigations proceed in a sequence of practical acts. A scene secured, notes taken, relatives interviewed, toxicology checked. In Marilyn's case, those steps were taken quickly, in the glare of intense media appetite. Deputy Coroner Thomas Noguchi and Chief Medical Examiner Theodore Curfey supervised the autopsy on August 5, 1962. Toxicology later reported levels of pentobarbital and chloral hydrate indicating acute poisoning. There were no signs of external trauma. The coroner's team consulted psychiatrists and considered her medical history, depressive episodes, a history of sedative dependence, in arriving at the conclusion of probable suicide. The autopsy records and coroner's notes would form the backbone of the official narrative. Neighbors, acquaintances, and medical professionals were interviewed. Dr. Ralph Greenson, her psychiatrist, Dr. Hyman Engelberg, her physician, and Dr. Ralph Greenson's colleague, among others. Actor Peter Lawford, Frank Sinatra circle, publicists, housekeepers, and friends were asked to recount the days leading up to August 4th. The picture they painted was of a woman increasingly fragile, with bouts of insomnia and dependence on medication. No reliable witness placed others in her bedroom during the hours when she likely died. The physical scene, the bottles, the bed, the state of the room did not show forced entry or sign of a struggle. Parallel to the formal investigation, other narratives began to take root. In later decades, claims surfaced about alleged wiretaps in her house, about secret visits by powerful men in the hours before she died, and about audio tapes that might prove she could not have taken her own life. Some of these claims originated from private investigators or alleged insiders. Others were driven by publishers and authors writing retrospective accounts. The crucial point: many of these sensational elements were never corroborated in official probes, and some were discredited or remained unverified. 2 decades after her death, renewed public interest and books alleging foul play prompted the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office to conduct a threshold inquiry in 1982. Deputy DA Ronald Mike Carroll led the review. The 30-page report concluded there was no credible evidence supporting a murder theory, and that the coroner's finding of probable suicide remained reasonable given the facts. That review closed the door on criminal prosecution, though it did not close the cultural debate. Across agencies, files revealed the churn of interest in Marilyn's life. The FBI's vault contains reprocessed records compiled under Freedom of Information Act releases. Those documents include memos, press clippings, and third-party tips. The CIA's reading room has redacted documents noting public speculation and internal curiosity. But neither agency produced definitive proof that a crime beyond the overdose had occurred. Instead, what the files provide is context, a map of how public figures intersect with national security concerns, rumor management, and reputational risk. At the center of the public imagination is a single incontrovertible fact. Marilyn Monroe performed for John F. Kennedy in May 1962. Delivering an intimate happy birthday that would become a cultural shorthand for her link, whether real or imagined, to the president. That performance is documented, photographed, and archived. What is not proven beyond doubt are the more intimate claims of affairs or of confessions exchanged in private rooms, claims that live in memoirs, interviews, and investigative books. Responsible storytelling asks us to separate what is recorded from what is alleged. Public records, including FBI files released decades later, show the Bureau received tips and gossip connecting Monroe with political figures. Yet the content of those files leans heavily on secondhand statements rather than corroborated evidence. They tell us what people were saying, not necessarily what happened. From an investigator's perspective, that difference is critical. One documents possible national embarrassment, the other proves a criminal act. One of the most persistent narratives concerns Robert F. Kennedy. Authors and later documentaries have described alleged visits by RFK to Monroe's house in the hours before she died. Some sources claim such visits involved an attempted breakup or tense conversation. These claims have circulated in books and interviews and were revisited in recent documentaries and reporting. Important to stress, while some witnesses and secondary accounts support parts of this story, official inquiries, including the 1982 DA review, did not find credible evidence to underpin a criminal narrative tied to those visits. The People magazine roundup of alleged accounts is an example of modern media aggregating historical claims useful for context, but not a substitute for corroboration. When a public figure vanishes, the public writes its own script. In the decades after August 1962, the cultural appetite for conspiracy filled the gaps left by official reports. Books claimed hidden diaries, tapes, and cover-ups. Some witnesses later recanted or were discredited. Others stood by their stories. The CIA and FBI files that trickle into public view decades later allow new readers to stitch together timelines. But the pattern is always the same. The story one tells depends on which witnesses one believes. This is the anatomy of myth, a foundation of fact, a scaffolding of testimony, and the human need to find a connective thread between fame and danger. Legally, the case had a clean, if unsatisfying, endpoint. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office ruled the death a probable suicide based on toxicology and psychiatric input. The District Attorney's 1982 review explicitly found no credible evidence supporting homicide claims and declined to open a criminal investigation. From a prosecutorial standpoint, the matter was closed. Culturally, nothing was closed. The image of Marilyn in that flesh-colored dress, the image of a woman who sang a breathless birthday to the president and then died alone months later, has been replayed, reinterpreted, and republished. Authors and filmmakers continue to probe the final months of her life, introducing new evidence or recontextualizing old evidence, to argue for interpretations that run the gamut from tragic addiction to political assassination. Each new claim invites renewed scrutiny because the line between political scandal and personal tragedy is often blurred by the human urge to make sense of abrupt loss. What the legal outcomes could not do was quiet the deeper questions about vulnerability and power. Why was she left so alone? Who benefited from her silence? Who feared what she might reveal? Those are not questions a coroner's report can resolve. They are moral and political questions, echoing in the corridors between Hollywood and the Beltway. Marilyn Monroe performed Happy Birthday, Mr. President for John F. Kennedy at Madison Square Garden on May 19, 1962. The performance is documented in photographs and contemporary coverage. On August 4th to 5th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe died at her home in Brentwood, Los Angeles. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office concluded the cause of death was acute barbiturate poisoning and ruled the death a probable suicide. Contemporary investigative records autopsy, coroner notes, toxicology show significant levels of pentobarbital and chloral hydrate in her system, medical findings that formed the basis of the coroner's ruling. The FBI and other federal agencies maintain files referencing Marilyn Monroe, collecting tips and press material. Those files were later released under FOIA and reprocessed in the 2010s, showing the breadth of public and official interest. In 1982, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office conducted a threshold inquiry into alleged murder claims and concluded there was no credible evidence supporting a murder theory, effectively reaffirming the coroner's original finding. These are the firm stones. Everything else, the alleged wiretaps, the purported secret visits by political figures in the final hours, the red diary some claimed existed remains disputed, partially corroborated, or unsubstantiated in ways that prevent them from forming a prosecutable narrative. The century's appetite for conspiracies is enduring. Over the decades, many claims were made that Monroe was killed because she knew too much, that her house had been wiretapped, that the mafia or union bosses or political operatives arranged her death. Authors, private investigators, and former law enforcement officers have advanced versions of these stories, some more credible than others. Memories decay, motives shift, and some witnesses who came forward were later discredited or had incentives to sensationalize. Investigators in 1982 found certain witnesses unreliable. The autopsy and toxicology don't show wounds consistent with homicide, and they indicate lethal levels of sedatives consistent with an overdose. While dissenting forensic interpretations exist, they remain contested rather than conclusive. Files released by agencies contain tips and hearsay as much as verifiable data. The presence of an item in an FBI file shows interest in a claim, not necessarily its truth. In the absence of incontrovertible evidence, the most responsible narrative is one that holds multiple possibilities. That Marilyn's death could be explained by addiction and depression, that it could involve foul play, and that some aspects may remain unknown. Historical honesty demands admitting the limits of our proof while refusing to indulge reckless assertion. Beyond headlines and files are people. Doctors who had treated a fragile patient, friends who remembered champagne nights and fragile mornings, fans whose grief was transmuted into mythology. The Kennedys, too, were affected publicly and privately by the swirl of claims that connected them to a woman who had become an American emblem. The human cost of these stories lives in the strain of relationships, in reputations battered by rumor, and in families trying to keep private grief from public spectacle. Marilyn's grave in Westwood receives bouquets from people who see in her a mirror, glamour and vulnerability in equal measure. Her death became an emblem of the dark side of fame and the endless, sometimes cruel, fascination of a nation that loves to retell tragedies dressed as scandals. This is a story about the delicate intersections of intimacy and influence, how a holiday smile on a stage can become a political scar, how private pain can be weaponized into public lore. The factual record gives us a frame, a performance for a president, a body found alone, an autopsy, and a DA's review that found no credible evidence of murder. Those are the pillars. But the human questions remain. How do we protect the vulnerable who orbit power? How do we resist the urge to trade compassion for spectacle? And when we retell these stories through books, documentaries, or late-night conversation, can we do so with both curiosity and restraint? Marilyn Monroe's life and death continue to teach us that celebrity can be a shield and a trap, that power can be intoxicating in the wrong hands, and that the holiday parties we imagine as benign can also be rooms in which reputations and lives are negotiated. If you leave this film with one image, let it be the woman who sang into a sea of faces and whose silence afterward asked a nation to examine itself. If you found this reconstruction meaningful, subscribe for more cinematic, evidence-based chronicles. Tell us below what surprised you and which part of the record would you like us to examine next.